our committee member, Dr. Richard Pears, kindly stepped into the breach at very short notice with a lecture that he had prepared earlier. Richard's day job is as faculty librarian for arts and humanities at Durham University, where he advises departments on acquiring and managing information and teaches research skills. Obviously very good at it himself. As Richard is of modest disposition, it probably needs me to tell you that as well as being a valued member of our own society, he is also a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London, President of the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle upon Tyne, and Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, together with, and also a member of the Great North Museum's Library Committee. How he finds time to come to our gatherings, I don't know, but there we are. So you will know that Richard has spoken to us on several occasions previously, most recently at our AGM event in May 2023, when he first talked about All Saints Church, Newcastle, and its architect, David Stevenson, and then went on to talk about St Anne's Church and its architect, William Newton. Indeed, neoclassical architecture in the North East seems to be something of a passion, which I'm sure will be apparent as tonight he tells us about Catholic country house building in Durham and Northumberland, 1570 to 1829.
So I'm going to give a talk that I began researching some time ago, something that intrigued me. As you know, I research country houses or great houses, and I'm always intrigued by the other. So we have the standard architectural history of country houses, people like Wren and Vanbrugh and Inigo Jones and Robert Adam. But there's also this other group of people who are not part of that Protestant British aristocracy and network of patrons employing these architects. And there are people who are excluded from that. So I'm going to talk about the country houses of the Catholic landowners. And I'm going to begin by an apology by saying I'm not going to talk about priestholes, though they will get a mention, nor am I going to talk about Jacobites, because that's a whole rabbit hole that we don't have time to go into tonight. Not all Catholics were Jacobites and not all Jacobites were Catholics. But again, I will mention some of them today. I'm not talking about working class Catholics. That's been dealt with by people like Leo Gooch, Francis Dickens and others. So I'm talking about those who are well off enough to afford to have land and be able to build houses. And I'm going to begin with this slide. Some of you will have been here, Capheaton Hall, which shows it as constructed by Robert Trollope for the Swinburne family in 1670s, in its formal layout of those very formal gardens with high walls around fountains and others, all of which has subsequently been swept away. So turning to the theme of my talk, I'm going to investigate two aspects of Catholic country houses. Firstly, to note that the architectural style of classicism was largely defined by Catholic counter-Reformation Italian architects being used by Protestant Britons for much of the time. Much of the decoration was done by Catholic craftspeople as well. And then I'm going to turn to look at the Catholic families and the houses that they built as well. So to begin with the idea of classical architecture being employed for country houses, going to begin with this building. And when Henry VIII and his Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals to Rome in 1534, it began with the preamble, "This realm of England is an empire." And the idea of an empire is that the king is answerable only to God. There is nobody like the Pope or anybody else there. So Henry VIII and his advisors began to look around for an architectural style that would be suitably imperial to signify the king's enhanced status. And of course, they fixed upon that of ancient Rome. Rome was something they were familiar with, their classical education. They would know about Pliny's villas and other works there. But also it was attractive for the Tudor government of Henry VIII and his successors, in that a Roman emperor was advised by a landed aristocracy in the Senate, a military society as well, and one that was seeking to expand, as Henry VIII sought to expand by taking over Scotland, Wales and being involved in Ireland as well. So Henry VIII himself remained doctrinally a Catholic, but it was really his son, the reign of his son, the boy King Edward VI, that Protestantism began to take effect in the English church. And led by Edward VI's uncle, the Duke of Somerset, who was the regent, Duke of Somerset looked to find an architectural style to signify his own importance as the ruler of the country. And so he fixed upon classical style, this Roman style, and began constructing the first Somerset House on the Strand, this building here. And we see here a structure that is completely different to many other buildings that had been experienced in England before. It's symmetrical. It employs the classical language of architecture, of columns, of styles of Ionic and Tuscan. It has symmetrical facades with bay windows, and you can notice the pediments, the triangular pediments across the window tops as well. So this was intended as a showpiece of Somerset's imperial rule on behalf of the boy king. The other attraction for them in terms of classical architecture was that they could claim to be inheriting the Christian church of the first apostles who had worshipped in Roman basilicas. So without what they saw as the distortion of the Catholic papacy in the medieval period. So they were saying we're going right back to the beginnings of Christianity. What did the first Christians worship in? They worshipped in Roman style buildings. So we'll adopt that as our form of architecture as well. And as well as buildings, we see classical style architecture heavily employed in church monuments. Classical, two very fine examples here. One, the Madison Monument. You see how the family are encased, surrounded by this rigid classical architectural frame with Corinthian columns there. So although the family are praying, they're in this very firm classical framework there. The attraction again of classical architecture was it didn't have anything that could be construed as papist, as Catholic, essentially. So you see the removal of Catholic symbolism from monuments and the use of classical styles instead. The other example, just to point out, is an 18th century monument to Nicholas Ridley, not the Protestant bishop and martyr, but to a member of the Ridleys of Blagden and Heaton. And again, here we see this idea of classical style being suitable for Protestant monuments. There's no hint of Catholicism here whatsoever. In fact, the artifice goes so far as to have the Nicholas Ridley commemorated by this lady in her Roman robes weeping against an urn. Of course, an urn contains cremated ashes, something would be an absolute abomination to 18th century Christians. But such is the artifice, anything but Catholicism they're trying to do. Going back to country houses, we see in the reign of Elizabeth attempts by her major councillors and aristocrats to build prodigy houses suitable to house the Queen. And they employ classical styles. They are symmetrical. They have large windows, columns, and orders of architecture are employed here. But they're also trying to blend in more traditional English architectural styles of castellated architecture. So they're really sort of classical castles in a way, and we see here. Now, in Elizabeth's reign, classicism was very little building took place by the Queen herself. It was very much the prodigy houses of her councillors that we look at today. When King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England and travelled to London, he did so very much with the idea that he had united the two kingdoms in his one person. And he said, the Northumberland and Durham and Cumbria, they were the middle shires of my kingdom now. There was no border between them. Similarly, born of a Catholic mother, but brought up as a Protestant, he himself said that he brought this balance, this unity to religion. And one of the symbols of that, he employed Inigo Jones to design the Banqueting House, a building that must have stuck out like a sore thumb in London at the time. Imagine timber-framed, jettied buildings, and this appears from beneath the behind the scaffolding. but it's intended to use classical architecture to suggest balance and harmony. So it has the Ionic style along the ground floor that symbolizes banqueting and joy. It is a banqueting house. And then where the king would have been for the banquets, the top story has Corinthian columns, that a very imperial form of architecture. And at the same time, his Archbishop of Canterbury and his clergy were attempting to restore what they called the beauty of holiness to churches. So during the reign of King Edward VI and Elizabeth's reign, much of the decoration within churches was obliterated by Protestant reformers. Archbishop Laud, and in Durham, John Cousin, the Dean of Durham and Dean of Peterhouse College in Cambridge, he tried to bring back a style of fixtures within churches that would not be seen as papist, but would celebrate and have decoration, this belief that religion should be a joyful experience and we give thanks to God with our craft and our skills as well. So we see this curious mixture in Cousin's woodwork of classical style columns supporting Gothic canopies. And again, go and look at the font cover in Durham Cathedral to see a fantastic example of that there. Laud set about recasing the medieval St. Paul's Cathedral, as you see on the right there, to the designs of Inigo Jones again. And Jones attempted to cover the cathedral in this classical style. It was completely recased, the nave, and they got up to the transepts before the Civil War in 1640, recased in new ashlar and given these classical style decorations. And along the front of it, they erected a colonnade, as you see there, of 40-foot high columns with imperial Corinthian capitals on, surmounted by statues of the king and queen along there. So this went into the reign of Charles I. Such was the extent of the building. So they're trying to convert a Gothic church with Catholic symbolism into a Protestant church, using the language of classicism to do so. Now, of course, the opposition, the Puritans, looked at this as the final straw, really. They were alarmed by King James's willingness to remove restrictions and persecution of Catholics. They were alarmed by his marriage to a Catholic princess, and that of Charles as well. And so when King Charles eventually fell out with Parliament, the Puritans very quickly pointed out that language of architecture was also being employed very much by the Counter-Reformation Catholic Church, which exactly has a screen of Corinthian columns across the new St. Peter's Basilica. So to the Puritans, this recasing of St. Paul's was just yet another sign that Charles I was really a papist, a Catholic in all but name. So it was quite deliberate that when Charles ultimately was executed in 1649, it was in front of the banqueting house, that sign of imperial kingship that his father had constructed and religious harmony, completely unacceptable to the Puritans, who had a very fixed view of intolerance to religious compromise that Charles and his father had tried to do. The same day that the king was executed, Parliament sent masons to St. Paul's Cathedral to smash the royal statues and the Corinthian capitals on that colonnade in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. And of course, we know the St. Paul's was ultimately destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. Now, the Puritans themselves were not averse to using classical symbolism in their architecture. They employed Robert Trollope to rebuild the Guildhall in a classical style. And as Pamela Graves has shown, at Bessie Surtees' house, this complex of merchants' houses built for the new Puritan rulers of Newcastle who succeeded after the parliamentary siege in 1644. Their houses were marked by these classical columns as well, but here they have these rods, the symbol of their God-given authority to rule over the people of Newcastle. So the Puritans are using architecture, the Anglicans are using classical architecture. What about the Catholics? Well, of course, yes, the Catholics are very much using classical architecture. As anyone who is familiar with the story of Sir Thomas Tresham of Northampton knows, he was an Elizabethan courtier. He spent 9 years in prison and paid the equivalent of over £2 million in fines for his Catholicism. After his first arrest and imprisonment, he came out of prison and built this building on the left-hand side, the Rushden Triangular Lodge, a study on the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, 3-sided, 3 stories, 3 gables. The numbers have symbolism as well. He was arrested, went back to jail for another 2 years, came out again and began constructing the building on the right, the lived-in new build, as it's called. Essentially a summer house on a high hill, visible for miles around, in the shape of a cross. And what you can't quite make out, perhaps, is along the frieze here are instruments of Christ's passion. So the crown of thorns, the 30 pieces of silver, the seamless cloth that was and dice that the Roman soldiers did. So very much, again, using architecture to restate his Catholic beliefs. So how is this understanding of classical architecture transmitted to people in Britain? Because one of the things about the Reformation was it cut off the cultural networks that had existed between craftspeople and architects. Henceforth, English people could really only go to Europe if they were involved in diplomatic missions, if they were involved in warfare, if they were involved had the patronage and the connections amongst European families to do so. So we begin to see, very much a reliance upon architecture.
Going the other way.
And the most famous, of course, are these two. Tutte l'opera de architectura by Sebastiano Serlio, and perhaps the most famous one, the I Quattro Libri di Architettura, 4 books of architecture by Andrea Palladio. These were Italian Catholic Counter-Reformation stonemasons and architects, and they claim to be showing how to rebuild Roman buildings. So these became the architectural Bibles, essentially, for people who wanted classical style detail on their houses. So these become the benchmark, really, for the classical styles. Now, of course, these books were in Italian, but they employed scale drawings, which meant that craftspeople could take those drawings and build from them. You could look at a drawing in Palladio's book and give that to a stonemason in England, and they would be able to build from that for you. Of course, there was also some exchange going on on a cultural level, that Sir Christopher Wren, for example, employed classical style extensively in his rebuilding of the London churches, most notably St. Paul's Cathedral. He'd been educated as a gentleman, so understood the classics, had been able to study architectural treatises, and he was able to make, because of his scientific knowledge, a visit to Paris in 1665, where he met with Francois Mansart, the famous French architect, and also Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who had completed St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And that seems to have timed his visit specifically to Paris. Wren went specifically to be able to meet Bernini, who he knew was going to be there at the same time. But he also observed the construction of the churches of Sorbonne and the Church of Val-de-Grâce, and in particular, the construction of the Great Court at the Louvre, where he spoke to the masons and engineers there and learned about the machines they were using to raise large stones and how to construct those as well. All things that he was to employ in rebuilding the London churches and St. Paul's Cathedral as well. And we see the interest that he gained in using domes over crossings and employment of classical architecture in St. Paul's Cathedral. Now, another way to get to Europe was to be a soldier. And Sir John Vanbrugh, one of the most famous architects, was a soldier and a playwright. And he also employed Palladio. Here we see one of Palladio's villas, Thiene, and this was used as the inspiration by Vanbrugh, one of the many inspirations for Seaton Delaval Hall. Vanbrugh was a soldier, and he was captured and was a prisoner of war. As a prisoner of war, he was held at the Chateau of Vincennes near Paris. And eventually, after claiming to be a Catholic, the family of the exiled King James II of England were able to get him permission to be able to go out in the courtyard. So I just show these very briefly to show some of the influences that Vanbrugh had many influences upon. He was interested in castles, he was interested in classical architecture, he studied Palladio and Serlio. But if we notice, for example, the comparison between Seaton Delaval and Vincennes, you have a large building, essentially tower at Seaton Delaval. You've got the keep, which is just visible behind the classical buildings there at Vincennes. So this is, if I show my own pointer, so this is the keep at Vincennes. My photograph is taken from about here on the drawing, looking past this range of classical buildings towards the keep. Now, if you were to turn this keep through 90 degrees to be here, you would essentially have a courtyard with corner towers and a large keep in the middle of it, very much like you have at Seaton Delaval. So here we have Vanbrugh being influenced by his prison. But also Vincennes had a large enclosed garden, now currently a French army base, covering the site, surrounded by high walls. And Seaton Delaval has this defended landscape around it as well, of walls and ditches and ha-has with bastions at the corners. There's even a medieval church in the grounds, as there is at Vincennes as well. So Vanbrugh is being inspired by this architectural style. And one of the most successful architects, classical architects in Britain and indeed in the Anglophone world, particularly in British America, was James Gibbs. Now, James Gibbs had gone to Europe as a Catholic. He'd left Scotland to train as a Catholic priest, but then changed vocation and had studied in an Italian art academy and became the only British architect to do so until the 18th century, until the end of the 18th century. And we see here his employment of classical architecture. His book, 1728 book of classical architecture, was the most important, has been called the most important classical treatise published in Britain in the 18th century. And you see here at St Martin in the Fields what became the model for churches all across the British world, particularly British America. You think about New England churches, this is the model. They're using Gibbs's book as the basis of that. But he got that training because he was a Catholic and could go and study in an Italian academy. He couldn't go to university in Britain because of his Catholicism, but he could study abroad. And local buildings that he designed include the library at St Nicholas's Cathedral in Newcastle, and also Kirkleatham Hall and several other buildings, Gateshead House and others too. So we have classical architecture being used as an inspiration, but the lens they're looking through is very much framed by these Italian Catholic architects. Just to point out locally, a local architect, Thomas Shirley of Durham, was also a recusant. He worked at Newton Hall near Durham and also on Ravensworth Castle and Streatham Castle, both of which are in demolished or in ruins. Well, they've all been demolished subsequently. So again, he is somebody, a Catholic, but he's working for these Protestant patrons to design classical architecture. And again, just to emphasize the point, the Baroque style took classical treatises, classical buildings in those books as inspiration. Not saying that Wren or Vanbrugh copied exactly. They used these other buildings as inspiration. The irony was that the Baroque architects Wren and Gibbs were displaced in around 1715 by Colin Campbell and Vitruvius Britannicus, and this idea that we should look at Palladio as the arbiter of architectural taste. And what we then see is really not inspiration from Palladio and Serlio, but actually direct copying. So you have here this idea that Baroque was too French, too Catholic. We need to go back to Palladio as the source of style, but actually you're copying an Italian Catholic architect as your Protestant British architecture. And within buildings, again, much of the expertise of craftspeople, painters such as Angelica Kaufmann, Swiss-Italian Catholic, the plasterwork we see of the Lafrancinis, the Artari, Vasari, Giuseppe Cortesi and others, these were all Catholics. They had got their experience and their knowledge by working around churches and buildings in Catholic Europe. And Stephen Brindle makes the point in his recent book on architecture in Britain that the stucadore had experience that no British craftsperson could have, because they couldn't work on buildings. There was no real architectural decoration to this level in churches, Protestant churches in Britain. There was always the fear in Britain of idolatry, of having religious symbolism. So we have here these traveling European architects and craftspeople particularly bringing these styles that they can only get this experience from the continent, where most British craftspeople can't go. And it's not really till the era of neoclassicism from the 1750s onwards, people like Robert Adam and then Stuart and Revett going and looking at the buildings of Greece, that we had the rule of this architectural style by Catholic Italian architects is broken by people going back and looking at Roman buildings, as Adam did, and using that as the basis for their decoration. Or as Stuart and Revett did, going and saying, well, actually, we should be looking at the Greeks, completely separate from Catholicism, as our inspiration. And we know Belsay Hall is one of the finest examples in this region of that. So we have this idea that classical style is the style. And this is one that Catholic families are able to see in Europe because they're able to travel to Europe. They send their children to be educated there, and they can go themselves. And it's not really again till the Grand Tour, Pears of Peace from the 1740s onwards, that more Protestant Britons are able to go and experience this themselves as well, to see European buildings and architecture. So I'm going to turn now and look at the Catholic families and say, well, how did they manage to build? As I pointed out at the beginning, I'm not talking about working class Catholics. I'm talking about landowning Catholics. And it's important to realize that the aim of Queen Elizabeth and James and Charles and the successors was to destroy the political and religious leadership of Catholicism. So the priests and any political person who tried to take authority in Britain. They were not trying to get rid of Catholicism. They found the way of finding them as a way of quite a lucrative source of income. So people were fined if they didn't turn up at the Church of England. They recused themselves from the Church of England services, and that's why they were called recusants. So they were the people being fined. It was quite difficult for the government to actually identify who was a Catholic, because large numbers of people simply went along to the Church of England service and sat through it reading their Catholic prayer book. It's not really till the Test Acts of 1683 and 1688 that you have to actually take communion in an Anglican church to hold public office. And that's when people then have to decide, right, I'm definitely a Catholic. And, not. So we have this period where the government chooses not to look too closely. If people don't go to Anglican churches, they are fined, they pay increased taxation, but they're not, certainly priests are being captured and persecuted and executed. Any political rebellions, they are put down with great severity. But most people are left to just pay the fines because it's a useful source of income. So I have here an example of a Catholic landowner. This is William Charlton of Heslyside, family that have lived there since the 14th century. In 1770, he had to declare his land to the Northumberland Quarter Sessions to be taxed upon this, the enhanced taxes for Catholics. This is a volume about this size. His land holdings run to 5 pages. This is a man with a lot of land, and he's using that to gain an income. And it's noticeable that the Charltons rebuilt Heslyside 4 times in the period that I'm talking about. So they're not without money. Other Catholic families, the coal trade on Tyneside in the early 17th century was dominated by Catholic families like the Hodgsons, the Selbys and the Tempests. It's not really till the Civil War that the Puritan government displaces those people in favour of Protestant merchants instead. So we see, for example, the Tempests and then the Widdringtons, who own Stella Hall. That is rebuilt in the Elizabethan period. This is after James Gibbs had given it a Palladian makeover in the 1750s. But they had substantial income from coal. So too did the Erringtons of Denton Hall near Newcastle. Nor were they shy. Cuthbert Errington sued the Earl of Northumberland for encroaching upon his collieries in Newburn. So again, they're not, shy at spending their money on building substantial houses. And of course, Gibbside was built. The hall that you see today is the basis of that is a house of the Catholic Blackiston family that the Bowes family later acquired from them. So these are families with big income from coal and are able to build as any gentleman and gentry family would expect to do. And then another source of income or not giving away the money was through intermarriage of Catholic families. So here we see the Mayor family who are come to of Hardwick Hall on the east coast of Durham. And this is some examples both of their Catholic education on the continent, but also their intermarriage. So we have, for example, down here, Mary is a nun at Ghent. Marmaduke is away young, died at Doway, where he was being educated in the Catholic college there. Henrietta Maria lived at Ghent. Richard Mayer is also at Doway. William Mayer is a Catholic bishop. Sir Henry Lawson of Brough Hall, an important Yorkshire family, married into the Mayer family. Sir John Clavering of Callerley, he married into his daughter Anne, married into the Mayer family as well. And we see examples of other Catholic families around the country. So they are marrying other Catholic families, so dowries are kept within the Catholic community there to enable them the money isn't spread out. So intermarriage is a powerful form of reinforcing their Catholic beliefs and also ensuring that they keep their estates together. And of course, as it shows down here, they're also able to have their children educated on the continent. They're able to travel on the continent. They can see European architectural styles, European paintings, sculpture, all the things that are very difficult for people to produce in Britain at the time. So let's look then at how the Catholic families employed those architectural treatises. One of the examples here from Surlier's book is the house of an illustrious prince in the style of a fortress. And this is, again, that classic problem of the aristocracy. You've got a medieval castle. How do you turn this into a classical country house? Well, Surlier's book is about how you make these changes to appear in classical style. So here you have a quadrangular fortress, big four-corner towers, has been recased in those classical style windows with pediments, the balustrades and others. The battlements have gone and replaced by pitched roofs, as you see there. Well, this was very influential amongst Catholic landowners in the northeast of England, beginning here. This is it's Lumley Castle after 18th century remodelling by Vanbrugh. But in the end of the 16th century, it was owned by Sir John Lumley. He was a very well-educated man, had studied in Italy. He got involved in one of the plots against Elizabeth. His father had been executed for the participation in the 1536 Pilgrimage of Grace. After he got involved in one of the plots, he managed to apologise to the Queen and sign over much of his estate around London to the Queen. And he retired to his house at Lumley and set about emphasising the lineage of his family and their beliefs. So we see at Lumley Castle, if you go and look at the entrance here, above the gate are all of these shields of families that had married into the Lumleys. This is John Lumley creating a memorial to his family there. Even more, on the inner gate, all of these shields here, families that married in there. And then if you've been to Chesley Street Parish Church, again, there were 4 genuine Lumley monuments to medieval members of the Lumley family. He added several more, so there's this continuous line of these people stretching into the distant past, running up the wall, essentially, that are fake. He's creating this false, this overemphasizing his family's importance and their lineage as a riposte to the nouveau riche Protestant families who are displacing Catholic families in positions of authority. And indeed, James I himself stayed at Lumley Castle on his journey from Edinburgh down to London to his coronation, where he was regaled by the history, about the family history of the Lumleys, and said, "Had your mouth, I had no idea Adam was a Lumley." I know. So, so this is a riposte using the lineage to emphasize we are Catholic families, we have this unbroken lineage going back centuries. But inside, this is still there, though unfortunately covered by a stage at the lower part. This fireplace is taken from Serlio's book. Further decoration was the Lumley horseman. This was one of the Lumley ancestors, not portrayed as a medieval knight, but as an Italian condottiere, one of the mercenary soldiers involved in the Italian wars of the 15th and 16th centuries. And then busts of the various kings that the Lumleys had served. The Lumley horseman is now at Leeds Castle in Kent. So here you have someone using their castle, taking inspiration from classical architecture to refit it as this classical style of palace, but emphasizing the lineage and the martial prowess of the family as well. On the border of Northumberland in Scotland, the government had a problem. Many of the landowning families were still Catholics, but they were essential up until 1603 to keeping the Scots out. You could not unpick these people from that society and still have an army able to keep the Scots out. So we see, for example, William Carr of Ford Castle, a ramshackle, sort of vaguely quadrangular castle. And here he attempted to convert this into something approaching that palace in the style of a fortress. So the gate tower was originally the one down at the bottom right there. And that was blocked up. You can see it blocked here and blocked here rather. And they punch a gateway, symmetrical gateway through the curtain wall, as you can see here. And then what had been the Great Hall is approached by a flight of steps in a symmetrical position. So this is the Great Hall, and they have these new corner towers erected in the corners to try and create suites of accommodation around the quadrangular castle. And Catherine Kent, in her PhD, did some analysis of this to show how that earlier medieval sort of ramshackle appearance was more regularized by William Carr in this classical style of suites of rooms, a hall and then chambers for visiting families. And you can see the entrance stairs in the corners are fundamental to enabling people to reach the suites of rooms in the corners, in the ranges. Up at Shillingham Castle, again, a castle severely damaged in the 1536 Pilgrimage of Grace. Here, the Catholic owner, Sir Thomas Grey, had been a ward of court of Lord Burghley, Queen Elizabeth's great minister, until he reached age of majority, when he came north to help keep the Scots out. He remodelled the castle again as this Renaissance fortress. So yes, we have the medieval towers you can see on either side, but in the middle is this symmetrical, rigidly symmetrical Renaissance range that he has put there, complete with the Tower of the Orders. If you go through there and look at the back of that range, again, you see this Renaissance doorway, the symmetrical arrangement of the windows, and also the corner towers to again get to the suites of rooms within the castle. And turning the other way, the Great Hall is given this classical loggia in front of it, reached by a flight of steps. So you're creating this symmetrical approach through this earlier castle, as Serlio had identified as the Renaissance fortress. And just to go back to the entrance, this idea of the Tower of the Orders, of the different classical styles of Tuscan or Doric, Ionic and Corinthian, we see here on a castle. And this is one of several examples in the north of England, very early before 1600. There is a most impressive one at Walworth Castle. Again, now Walworth was built by someone who was almost certainly a church papist. Thomas Jennison was Queen Elizabeth's controller of works of Berwick. So he's the man who was actually paying for those Elizabethan artillery walls to be built on behalf of the Queen. He's probably a church papist to have that position, but his four sons were being brought up as Catholics. So the family's very much there. He bought what had been a single-towered castle near Darlington and remodeled it. It's been remodeled in the 18th century, as you can see, with the sash windows. But it's an artifice, this martial face, because round the side you can see this very large bay window. And if we go to the other side, originally it was a U-shaped building. The Victorians unfortunately slapped this kitchen wing to close off the courtyard. But this would have been originally, the approach would have been from this end to go between the arms of the U, seeing those bay windows there as well. And what you would have looked at would be this, Tower of the Orders. Unfortunately, the restaurant has covered it with a glass, they've covered over the courtyard with a glass roof. You can't imagine that happening in Oxford or Cambridge, but there you are. But what you have here is a perfect Tower of the Orders with a symmetrical entrance, and then you have the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian columns above there as well. So this would have been a showpiece for anybody coming to be entertained at Jennison's house. And this idea of the Tower of the Orders, again, has a Catholic origin. Amongst the first to be constructed, based upon illustrations in Serlio's book of ceremonial gateways erected for princes and kings arriving in Catholic cities in Europe. Amongst the first were those at Gonville and Caius College at Cambridge University. Now, Caius himself was a Catholic. He was eventually forced out of the university because he refused to take the oath of allegiance to Elizabeth. But he endowed the college. He travelled and trained as a doctor in Padua. He trained at Sorbonne in Paris. Very educated man. And he used classical architecture, these gateways, to create this route through the college, these different levels of knowledge that students were acquiring. We're more familiar from our architectural treatises about seeing the other towers of the orders at the universities. For example, at Merton, at Wadham College, and in particular the one at the Bodleian Library, which is often given as the archetypal Tower of the Order. These were almost certainly built by a Yorkshire mason called Thomas Holt, who had worked on Catholic buildings in Yorkshire. And actually, as we can see, the Bodleian Library is one of the last of them. The earliest ones are some of the ones in Northumberland and Durham, and the one at Burghley House for Elizabeth I's minister as well. So we have this style being used by Protestant Catholics, but it's being used for different ideological reasons. So what is it about this style that is attractive to the Catholics? Well, in Serlio's book, his book of architectural works, the Tower of the Orders is shown in connection with one building in particular, one building that would have very, very close symbolism to Christians facing persecution on the Colosseum in Rome. So you can see here the Catholics are marking their houses with this symbol of persecution. Now, not everyone could afford a Tower of the Orders, so we see the development of Elizabethan houses. Here we have Cuthbert Heron, who added the new East Range to Chipchase Castle on the North Tyne Valley, with this very fine porch in the centre and classical columns there as well. Now, Cuthbert Heron was almost certainly a church papist as well. In fact, he was the sheriff of Northumberland at one point, so he clearly was going to the Anglican churches, even if not communicating, and was able to hold a local government office. He was a sheriff without any guns, however, because in 1631, the house was raided to take away his guns. And the reason for that is, as is explained in the handwritten text down below from the records, is his wife is a recusant. So his wife is a Catholic, and they're bringing their children up as Catholics as well. So they don't want him, even though he's the sheriff, they don't want him having any guns. And his wife, he married two Catholics, the Carnabys of Halton near Rothbury, a Catholic family, and then he married the daughter of William Fenwick of Wallington, again, another Catholic family that came to grief. So we see from the middle of the 17th century, classical architecture also being employed on remodelling other castles. This is Callerley, which we visited a couple of years ago, remodelled from a tower house, probably two tower houses actually, with a hall range in the middle, by Robert Trollope in the 1670s. And here we have, again, a classical centerpiece between the two towers there. So not a quadrangular castle, but they're remodeling it, and what they have as the entrance facade. Other features, it was remodeled in the 1740s probably by the Lafrancinis. And again, we saw some of this fabulous decoration when we were on our visit. But you'll notice they also, in the 1750s, built a very large Catholic chapel, which was subsequently, after the family gave up their Catholicism, employed as the ballroom. Trollope, of course, is an intriguing character because he's an architect, a mason, a stonemason brought from York by the Commonwealth, the Puritan authorities, to rebuild the Newcastle Guildhall. But then after the return of the monarchy in 1660, he then made his living largely building for Catholic families. And amongst his finest works were this Capheaton Hall for the Swinburnes. And as you can see, it is very much modelled upon a house designed by Serlio again. And Sir John Swinburne had been educated at Douai in northern France. His family travelled extensively on the continent, and he clearly had architectural knowledge, because the contract for the work with Trollope that survives at Capheaton describes, and it must have an Italian roof. It must have Doric columns and things as well. So the patron is showing he has architectural knowledge gained from his own travels in Europe. And that's Trollope's design there, and that's his rule that's now in the Science Museum in Edinburgh. Interestingly, the first floor plan of this shows that the room in the centre, which ostensibly would be the banqueting room or the dining room overlooking those formal gardens I showed in my first slide, that is shown on the plan to be the old chapel. So it was being used as a Catholic chapel as well as the dining room, depending on need. Related to the Swinburnes were the Thorntons of Netherwhitton, which is the slide that I'd used on the flyer for my talk. And I did want to keep it secret. I didn't want to name it, but I was told I had to name it. But here we have inspiration from another Catholic artist visiting Britain, Peter Paul Rubens, who published the book The Palazzo of Genoa. And here we have a Genoese palazzo in Northumberland for a Catholic family. And I suspect that Trollope was probably also responsible for this house, Harroton Hall, now embedded in Lambton Castle, to give you a clue where it is, for the Catholic Hedworths. They were another family before the end of the 17th century who had considerable coal wealth. That's the River Wear on the right-hand side, and the black piles are their coal wealth being put onto keels to be ferried down to Sunderland. And that's the source of their wealth. So they're saying, we have all this coal, this is what is paid for this Italian classical style house. And then we have a very long-standing Catholic family, the Charltons of Heslyside, and I mentioned about their land holdings. Now, there was a tower here which occupied the two bays, the windows on the right, where the people are standing until the 1790s. And Pevsner's, the Northumberland County History describes the usual tower to which in 1631 a hall was added east-west. What we see now is a remodelling of 1719. As I said, they were able to rebuild the house several times with that symmetrical carriage entrance going through it. What was intriguing to look at the plan is this is a house, this is a courtyard house. So just to orientate you, this was the facade we were looking at. That was the former carriage entrance. And this wall here is really quite fascinating, because if you stand in the courtyard and look at it, that's the wall. And what you can make out in the wall is that there are arches embedded in the wall. And this corbel has the date 1631. Now, it might be misplaced. I suspect it might be. But if you reconstruct those arches, what you have is this classical loggia around the inner courtyard. What I've done there is to mirror the picture and take away the later wings there. But you know, this is very much, so again, we have this, take away that later wing, you have here this classical style house, central entrance, carriage entrance going through into a courtyard. And actually, I then looked up, doing a bit of research about William Charlton and who had built this, and discovered that he was educated here, the Jesuit College in Saint-Omer, where that large carriage entrance, those full-height columns, feature in his old school. So again, he's using perhaps experience of classical buildings in his education. And the Charltons rebuilt Hesyside again in the 1790s to the designs of William Newton. The towers removed and replaced by this now very Palladian austere range there. The Charltons have a comparable family in Durham, the Salvins of Croxdale Hall, just south of Durham. A very intriguing house, one that really needs a thorough investigation. It's on a promontory above the River Wear and the River Brownie there. And it seems, I think, to really have perhaps been two courtyards. There's description in the early 1600s of taking down, moving the east window in the Great Hall. The only place it can be now is where the staircase is in the entrance hall. So I wonder whether it has actually been a double courtyard house like Hardwick Hall or Hampton Court. And the original approach was this way towards it. So we might expect some kind of range here, a hall in the centre, and then the private family apartments, which largely constitute the house today. I think what they have done is demolish those other parts of the house and focused upon the family range as the principal house today. Now, 1720s, they had this plan drawn up to try and put this facade, this new, onto that rather ramshackle earlier building. This screams really Vanbrugh or probably William Etty as an example, and is very similar to a house probably by William Etty on the Lambton estate, Biddick Hall, where you see exactly the same Ionic pilasters and central pediment there. The Charltons didn't, the Salvins didn't go ahead with that plan. I suspect in the aftermath of the First Jacobite Rebellion in 1715, such an ostentatious display of Catholic wealth would have attracted too much attention. So they did remodel their house in the 1750s and then later in 1805. This rather plain facade is put on first on the left-hand side, the west front, and then the later 1805 front. But inside, they employed the Italian Catholic Giuseppe Cortesi stuccatore to produce this fantastic plasterwork in the hall and the dining room you see there, and have all these itemized in the Salvin records. And above the staircase is this superb classical ceiling by Giuseppe Cortesi as well. So they're hiding behind a plain exterior, but showing their wealth for those friends they can trust to get inside their house. However, they were not that secret because they had a priest's house. They employed their own chaplain. And in 1807, they had their family chapel remodeled very much in the style of Wyatt's work at Bishop Auckland for the Bishop of Durham. I mentioned the genealogy that I showed earlier was the mayors of Hardwick, Hardwick Hall near Blackhall Colliery. Now, these people were Jacobites. Francis Mayor wrote in his diary in 1730, as the house was being reconstructed for the family, that he was going to France to see my one true king, the old pretender there. So the house was rebuilt in two large phases. What is interesting is they had a long history of sheltering Catholic priests being near the coast. There's this cave in the grounds. The Dean is now used by people just throwing old washing machines and things into it, which is a tragedy because I think it must have been quite a sublime experience with the water running off the limestone and things down there. But it's actually quite dangerous to move around in now. But there is this natural cave that had Catholic carvings in it, but they've now been lost. And this is thought to be where priests hid while the house was being searched by the government officials. And there's said to be 2 priest holes within the house. Francis Mayor was also something of a botanist. He had the house redecorated and plastered, but he also had an arboretum, essentially. He had he bought pear trees and cherries and apricots, and had 34 different varieties of apple trees. So again, you know, all now lost, but is there recorded there. And then I mentioned about Catholics being able to travel. One of the most famous travellers in the 18th century on the Grand Tour was Henry Swinburne, youngest son of the Capheaton Swinburnes. And his brother left him this area of land at Hamsterley in Durham. And here you see Hamsterley Hall, this Gothic-style house, after its recent superb remodelling for the Spry family. And he'd been educated in France. He met his wife, Martha, in France. She'd been educated at the Ursuline Convent in Paris. And so they travelled extensively in Europe. And it's Henry Swinburne who wrote one of the first guidebooks to exploring Spain. In fact, his maps were so accurate, they were the only thing that Wellington's armies had to use in the Peninsular War. But he also travelled to the Two Sicilies and wrote a travel book about travelling in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So very well cultured and travelled man, but able to move around the courts of Europe as a gentleman, as a Catholic, and get those introductions and look at the art and other things there. So, of course, it's all very well being able to go to Europe, but the Catholic families also wanted to maintain the Catholic faith in their areas as well amongst their tenants. And so I mentioned about the Catholic chapel on the first floor of Capheaton Hall. Other examples of Catholic chapels that were known in these older buildings at Pontop Hall, at Stanton Hall at the top right, Witton Shield down here, and Tuddow, another of the Salvan houses near Durham down there as well, each with its own Catholic chapel. Up at Felton Hall, the main hall on the left-hand side has been demolished in the 1950s. What remains today, was for sale for a couple of £1 million last year, is the wing on the right-hand side. That's orientated east-west, and it's thought that that possibly had the schoolroom and Catholic chapel in there as well. Now, after Catholic emancipation, they built their own large Catholic church, which you can just see behind the tree on the left-hand side, and that's now a separate house. The Silvertops, a Tyneside family with long involvement in the coal trade, bought land up beside Concert and built the house at Minster Acres, which is now a Passionist monastery. But it has this rather curious L shape, perhaps to shield the main front from the wind. But the schoolroom and Catholic chapel were originally in this wing on the left-hand side there. And then again, if you know Minster Acres, after Catholic emancipation, they built a large Catholic chapel just off the picture to the left as well. We visited on our trip to Calais a couple of years ago. We went to Biddleston and saw the chapel there. So again, the hall, possibly built by John Carr, has been demolished. This was the Catholic Selby family, another Tyneside family who eventually forced out the Tyneside coal trade, moved up into Northumberland. They had a medieval tower that's now the ground floor with the Catholic chapel built above it. And you can see that on the right-hand side of the black and white photo there. The reign of George III was more tolerant time for Catholics. George had Catholic friends, and notwithstanding the Gordon riots in 1780, which destroyed a lot of Catholic property, which appalled King George, and he sent royal troops to guard Catholic chapels, he was willing to allow Catholics to build churches or build chapels, so long as they didn't look like a church. And so we have interesting examples. For example, St. Michael's Church at Esh Lord near Durham, which was intended to look like a farm from the road. It's obviously been given, Gothic windows and things later on. The Catholic chapel, St. Andrew's Chapel on Warwick Street in Newcastle, that was originally in the back garden of Father Warwick's house on Pilgrim Street. Similarly, in Berwick, the Catholic chapel is at the end of a burgage plot that the Catholic family had owned, that, and they built the chapel behind, so it was out of sight. So it's not until Catholic emancipation, really, that you get large Catholic chapels being built. But George, or rather his son, the Prince Regent, was also willing to allow this building to be constructed in Durham in 1804, Ushaw College, designed for the training of Catholic priests. Again, so long as it didn't look like a Catholic church. So the chapel was actually in a rear range. you will notice I've carefully removed from my photograph the enormous Catholic chapel by Dunn over here and the matching one over there as well. But this is the idea. As long as it doesn't look like a Catholic church, you can build now. That George III very much more tolerant. And perhaps some of that reciprocity in toleration is one of the last Catholic houses to be built before the Catholic emancipation in 1829 was Cheeseburn Grange, to the design of Dobson. Ironically, or perhaps deliberately, in Tudor-Beaton style, perhaps signalling a reconciliation with the regime that had done such harm to Catholic families. But again, they have their own Catholic chapel, as you can see here, to provide for the faith of their tenants. And I'm going to conclude with that the story has not quite ended. To say, in Gateshead, the Riddell family had a house, Gateshead House, which stood just on the approach to roughly where the Tyne Bridge is. If I tell you this building here is still there, one of the few Grade 1 listed buildings in Gateshead. It's the former medieval hospital on the right hand side there, with the larger chapel added. After the dissolution of the monasteries, it appears the Riddells had bought that land from Henry VIII's commissioners and built a house out the remains of the hospital, but kept the chapel. The house was destroyed, just to go back one, the house was destroyed by a mob on the day that the Duke of York arrived. So Duke of Cumberland arrived in Newcastle chasing Bonnie Prince Charlie. The Riddells obviously decided that staying so close to Tyneside wasn't good for them. But it's interesting that what's left of the house is this now completely disconnected classical style doorway to the right of the medieval chapel. So they clearly had classical features on their house. They moved up to Northumberland, up to Swinburne, where they had some land there, and had a 18th century house constructed for them. Main house 1750s, wings 1780s. That main house was demolished in the 1950s as well, one of the many country houses lost, and the family converted the stable wing to be their house. They also, after Catholic Emancipation Act was passed in 1829, they built a chapel for the Catholic community, which is still in use. They had already built a large entrance screen in neoclassical style on the main road to announce their house. But what I think fascinating, and as I say, the story goes on, is that Richard Elphick was commissioned in 2002 to rebuild a country house for them on the footprint of the original house that had been demolished. So the story of Catholic country houses is not quite over. It still continues. So in my talk tonight, I've tried to show that classical architecture has meanings and has religious significance. It was employed deliberately as the new Protestant imperial style, but it's also style being employed by the Counter-Reformation Catholic Church in Europe. The Catholic people who remain with enough wealth to do so employ classical architecture as a symbol of their faith and their common learning with their Protestant peers as well. But they're able to use their wealth to build and to use their experience of continental culture, often denied to their Protestant peers, to use classical style in innovative ways in their own country houses. So thank you very much for listening.